Good morning. I'm Howard Husock. I'm a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute in Domestic Policy Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our discussion this morning, what is the future for primaries? And by those we mean primary elections in the United States political process. It's no surprise, and I'm sure to anybody who's watching this presentation, that anybody who follows American politics today knows that the word primary has recently become a verb, as in, I can't vote for that because I'll get primaried. Or if she primaries him, she'll beat him. The term refers, of course, to primary elections, the preliminary votes which political parties use to choose their nominees or to winnow a wide field of candidates in advance of a November general election. Increasingly, however, concern has arisen that primaries, especially closed primaries limited to registered voters of one party, may be skewing our politics and contributing to polarization. In New York City, for instance, there are nearly 1 million voters not registered either as Democrat or Republican, yet they are excluded, in effect, from voting in primary elections. Not in effect, they are. In the election just passed, we saw across the United States, one party spent heavily in the other party's primaries in order to nominate candidates believed to be easier to defeat in November. And we saw a former president, aiming to demonstrate his ongoing influence, endorse Republican primary candidates across the country, not always successfully. Primary elections, in other words, are a key part of our democratic process, yet the rules governing them vary dramatically from state to state and city to city. Increasingly, advocacy groups, including one from whom we'll hear today, are coming forward with the aim of changing those rules. But is that a good idea? This morning we'll examine the pros and cons of doing so, but before we have that discussion, we're going to take a big step back with our first of two panels and discuss how we reached this point, where primary elections come from, what impact they're having in our current election process. After this first panel, whose participants I'm about to introduce, we'll have a second panel where we'll learn more about the rules that govern primaries, and we'll have a pro and con discussion about whether and how those rules might be changed. We begin with our first panel, and on my far right, Kevin Kosar is a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies the political process. Before joining AEI, he spent more than a decade working for the Congressional Research Service, on whose research many of us have long relied. He's focused there and here on a wide range of public administration issues. He's taught public policy at New York University, and he's written a book very current in its importance, Congress Overwhelmed: The Decline in Congressional Capacity and Prospects for Reform. Henry Olsen is a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center here in Washington. He studies and provides commentary on American politics, including many times a week in the Washington Post, where he has a wide and dedicated following, including myself. He writes on foreign affairs, American conservative thought, and is the author of a wonderful book called The Working Class Republican, Ronald Reagan and the Return of Blue-Collar Conservatism, ahead of its time. And finally, John Fortier, also a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on Congress and elections, election demographics, voting, including absentee voting, the U.S. presidency, and the Electoral College. And before joining AEI, he was director of governmental studies at the Bipartisan Policy Center, as well as a contributor to the AEI Brookings Election Reform Center. He's the author and editor of After the People Vote, A Guide to the Electoral College, which makes him in hot demand lately. So what I'd like to do is to begin with Kevin, followed by John, to give us kind of the historical overview, and then we'll turn to Henry Olsen to talk about how primaries are affecting things currently. So to my right, Kevin Kosar.
Well, good morning. Primaries, where to begin with them? As no doubt all of you know, primaries are kind of the first election that we tend to run before we get to the general election, and that primaries are typically partisan exercises. They are these Republicans and Democrats usually elections where they try to pick a candidate so that come general election time, you have a Republican running against a Democrat, a two-person race. Now, stepping back and thinking about like where did this device come from, it was not something used at the founding. It's come about in the last 100 years and it's become increasingly popular. Primaries emerged as a tool for selecting candidates around the same time that America started to see a lot of places adopting things like ballot initiatives, referenda, and recalls of public officials. They also came about around the same time that we had the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, which said the people get to pick senators as opposed to having it done through the state legislatures. So when you think about primaries, it's worth remembering that they have a history and a kind of desire to give more power to the people. They were a democratizing type reform. No doubt we can dig in deeper to the history, and John certainly knows plenty of that. So let me just dig in a little bit to this whole question of like, what's a primary? And one thing I want to say up front is that they're not all the same. In fact, they're very different. One of the wonderful things about federalism in this country, that we don't have a centrally directed elections administration, is that states and localities can experiment. And when it comes to primaries, states have done all sorts of things as far as how they structure them. Now, having said that there's a ton of nuance there, I'm going to proceed to then go in the opposite direction and explain to you how we can lump them into four simple categories, four types of primaries. And the kind of criteria I use for doing that is thinking about who gets to participate. In a primary, do you have to be a registered party member to participate in that party's primary? So if I'm a Republican, do I only get to participate in the Republican primary? Can anybody else participate in the Republican primary? Can a Democrat cross over to vote into it? Can independents show up and vote in it? If you use that, public access, public participation as your kind of evaluative criteria, I think you can carve up primaries into kind of four basic types. Closed primaries, which, as alluded to, would be, these are primaries that are closed to anybody who is not a member of the party throwing the primary. Partially open primaries. These are ones where, unaffiliated or independent voters might participate. Open primaries, anyone can vote in the party primary. And then, reality being the mess that it is, I have a fourth category, which I just call same-ticket runoff systems. And these are instances where voters all participate, and voters get a ballot that's nonpartisan, meaning every party is listed on there. And every candidate who wants to run, and if they have a preference for a party or a formal affiliation, that might be listed there. So these are the kind of four types, and across the country, if we're talking about congressional elections, and that's what I'll limit myself to, about 16 states have closed primaries, 11 are partially open, 19 are open by that definition, and about 4 states do the kind of same ticket runoff system. And I should say something about that latter category because it's an interesting one. Examples of same ticket runoff system two of them are Alaska and Louisiana. Alaska, as many of you no doubt have read, instituted what was called a Final Four system, where they had this primary, but everybody could vote in the primary. It wasn't a partisan run primary. Gobs and gobs of candidates could get in there. And then ultimately they moved to a general election, and ranked choice voting is used to pick amongst the final 4 candidates. Louisiana, on the other hand, they've got something that's interesting. Rather than have a primary, and most primaries are kind of earlier in the year, they do the equivalent of a primary at the time of the general election. And again, it's an open event. Voters get to pick and choose as they like on their ballot. And there's a threshold. If somebody doesn't run away with it, get 80% of the vote or some exorbitant number, they'll do a runoff election shortly afterwards where the top two candidates, then the voters go back and vote for them. So we've got a huge variety in these systems, huge amount of experimentation that has happened over the years. And so that's kind of like the basics of the topography on that. With that, I'll hand it back to you, Howard.
Well, thanks, Kevin. I think there's some discussion lately about the runoffs, which are common in the South, and we're about to see one with Herschel Walker and Raphael Warnock in Georgia, that was actually a residue of Jim Crow because it was an attempt to make sure there was at least one strong white candidate in case a black candidate would split the vote. Do you buy into that?
Whatever the roots may be, the dynamics today are clearly different. Look, Georgia's going to have a black senator. That's just the way it's going to work. The real trick with any time that you have a kind of primary election and general election, or a general and then a runoff, is you're asking people to show up twice. And people are busy. People are happy to go out and vote. Well, half to 60% of Americans are happy to go out and vote, but asking people to vote twice is a pretty big ask. And so getting the turnout to show up is a real trick. And when you stretch that time out so that people are voting first in the spring and then not voting again until November, what you tend to get is that first election people just don't tend to show up for in large numbers.
So we're now foreshadowing our pros and cons discussion, and you've put down a marker, so I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
And now I want to turn to John Fortier to talk about when did primaries start to emerge as important elections. I have a theory, and it has something to do with the story of Rip Van Winkle, which you may not have thought about lately. But when Rip Van Winkle woke up after 18 years, he went to the local pub where he used to hang out, and the first thing they asked him was, "Are you Federalist or Democrat?" So it was a coffeehouse primary. Okay.
Thank you. No. That's a
that was slightly tortured.
That's a very helpful introduction, and in fact, I think if we're thinking about the Hudson Valley in New York, we actually might want to move a little bit further west to Western Pennsylvania, but not so far off in that era when some of these things began. So I'm not going to bore people with all the details of the history of primaries, but Kevin laid out, I think, some of the big picture, and what we tend to think about today is a progressive era movement. But in some ways, there's some earlier history as well, and I think the history we remember especially is about the presidential primary, which, kind of to oversimplify, in the 1912 election, we started to use in significant fashion. It persisted in a number of states, but in a kind of a mixed regime that we had, where some states used primaries for the presidential election and some didn't, until the 1968 and post time, where essentially we have a primary or caucus, where some people being involved in electing the candidates being the primary mode that really every presidential candidate has to go through. But it does go back earlier, and I think, again, Kevin made this point, but I want to restate this. One thing about America being a decentralized country for elections, or just generally decentralized, is a lot of our reforms have come state by state, or in this case even county by county, or party by party in various places. Technically, I think people will date the beginning of primaries to the Crawford County primary in Pennsylvania in 1842, and I was going to jokingly ask Ben Ginsberg in the audience if he was there, but that was a Democratic primary, so you may have been watching from the other side. But what interesting, you did see, again, a kind of spreading and a variety of primaries, and it was both something pushed by some reformers outside parties, but it was certainly also pushed by reformers within parties, and it was a reaction, simply put, against the convention system, which had taken over essentially in America as the way we pick candidates, not only at the presidential level, again, a national convention, but at the state and at the county level. And again, these reactions about the sort of insider game and the corruption and other things in the party, and the sense that the people needed to be involved was key in moving these things forward. I also want to just put on the table how unique America is in terms of primaries. There certainly are primaries in primary-like elections around the world, but they're more the exception than the rule, and ours permeate our whole system. Right? There, of course, are some nonpartisan elections and some more systems that Kevin is describing that maybe move away from a direct primary in a certain way. But if you think about at every level, from federal, state, local, in many cases local, we have primaries everywhere. And we've had the same two political parties since the 1850s. And so, again, a kind of strong two-party system with primaries that are everywhere and at every level is something we just don't see. And you see around the world some places hankering for this, wanting this. We're worried about the problems of primaries. But there are places where you say, well, the people should decide more. And of course, there are all sorts of hybrids between a kind of very closed convention of strong party members, sometimes really official party members, delegates, to those that are a little bit broader, to those that are essentially allowing anybody who kind of loosely wants to say they want to be part of the process of picking a party's nominee to come forward. And so, again, we're a pretty unique place. So I will move from the history a little bit to just a few of the kind of broad issues that have really always been with us. One is the question of party control and what that means. And I know Elaine Kamarck in the next panel will talk about this a little bit, thinking about a party filter or a party gauntlet that you should go through, or some role for party leaders that is important for picking the candidates that is either independent or works along with the public aspect of it. The voting happens, but there's also a role for party leaders. And to what extent should our system of picking candidates have some of that as part of that? And I think both the reforms we're talking about, but just generally the primaries themselves. The primaries themselves were a move away from having leaders or people who had blocks of votes or party bosses or whatever you wanted to call them, having the more final say to the people being primarily in charge. One big question, or there are two related questions that people ask about primaries is that about turnout and about how representative they are and how good a gauge they are for picking party sentiment. People are voting, yes, but is it a small sliver? Is it an unrepresentative sliver? Are we electing candidates who are farther right, farther left? And here, I think there's some dispute in the literature, but I guess I would characterize it as sort of a relatively narrow dispute in terms of how strongly the differences are between a primary electorate and the sort of whole of the party. And I think most of the literature shows that at least there is certainly a demographic difference between people who vote in primaries and the broader electorate that might vote in a general election. It's more elite. Certain demographic groups are represented as well. But in terms of preferences, in terms of does the average voter in a Republican or Democratic primary look dramatically different than someone who show up in a general election and vote for that party? For example, is a Republican primary voter far to the right or a Democratic primary voter far to the left of those general election voters? I think the answer is no. They're not as different as popularly we say. There is some difference, but it's not as far off as you think. And one reason for that is we have a kind of loose system, different systems as to who gets to vote in primaries. Is it just the official registered people, anybody, people of the other party even? But you think about the many people we have who are independents or call themselves independents. There's some debate about how independent they are, but let's just state that some of them certainly are, some of the independents are kind of pretty regular Republican voters. Some of the independents are pretty Democratic voters. And so in that sense, you do have people out there who might not be eligible for a primary, but are kind of going to vote along with the party. And sometimes they're actually more, let's say on the right, more conservative. The independents, maybe they're Tea Party people or people who are not establishment Republicans, and they might actually be more to the right of some of the people. So I think the idea that increasing turnout by itself would just completely get rid of the kind of polarization or bring us much more to the median voter by itself, I think is probably not true. I do think there is a good effect to thinking about wanting greater primary turnout. And let me just put a couple numbers on the table. It's very hard to measure primary turnout because what do you mean by it? We have lots of elections where there's no primary, right? There's just an incumbent or there's just a very cursory primary. There's no reason to show up in some ways. We also have primaries that happen at the same time as other elections. We have primaries in midterm elections. We have primaries that appear at the same time as presidential ones. And so it's very hard to figure out what primary turnout is. But I'm just going to use one example from this last election at which people have pointed to, the Ohio Republican primary, which was a big primary with a lot of people in it, and a more populist Trump-like candidate came out and is going to be the senator, J.D. Vance. That primary, about a million voters voted on the Republican primary. Now, if you looked at the general election, J.D. Vance, Republican, got about 2 million votes, a little bit more than that, but close to that. If you looked at Donald Trump's election in Ohio, who won Ohio in 2020, he got about 3 million votes. And this is a little bit unfair to sort of slip this number in there, but that election was about 2/3 of the 67% of the electorate eligible voters turning out. So if you wanted to kind of push it forward, you'd say, well, there are probably 4 million-ish Republican voters out there who might have voted if everyone voted and it followed the same patterns. So you can see it's certainly less, and there's an argument that we should do better, and I think there's some good reasons why parties might want to do better. But again, it depends on how you judge it. It's not a tiny fraction of the people. It's not a convention. It's not just a party members. It's not even a kind of expanded convention. And I'm interested to hear a little bit about the Virginia Republican experience last time, which is not tiny, but a slightly larger group. But you can think of all sorts of electorates. But it's a decent fraction of the electorate. Two last things. One, I was part of a commission at the Bipartisan Policy Center, which looked at sort of general reform issues and really needed to get buy-in from both parties. And it's hard to sometimes get that agreement between the parties, what the problems are, what the solutions are. But this group really came around the idea of, well, we don't know exactly how to do it, but it would be a good thing to improve primary turnout. And I'm going to say it's good, maybe not for the reasons that it's going to dramatically change the dynamic of who gets elected. I think the polarization is probably not going to be affected that much. But I think it's good for the political parties themselves. And I think here's somewhere where the political parties have not thought enough about their own interests. In some ways, they're at least officially kind of hands-off. There are definitely party players who try to pick candidates and help candidates, but the parties themselves tend to be a little more hands-off. And sometimes they're indifferent, really, to who shows up. And I think there's a good reason to think, well, why wouldn't you want more people to show up? And therefore, why wouldn't you want to have open primaries, at least in a sense, open primaries means allowing people who are certainly independents or maybe even of the other party to come to your party. An extreme example of that was the Republican Party during much of the 20th century in the South, which was a losing party, the minority party. Not there weren't very many people. Republicans didn't get on the ballot that often, but one of the things they felt they had to do was let everybody come, just to allow them to kind of socialize themselves to coming to the party and be part of that. And I think that's an important reason to think about, even if you don't go as far as reforms that are more exotic, if you want to call them that, they move away from the direct primaries, to think about just ways in which parties themselves might be in their own self-interest to really open up and to encourage candidates to be able to run in big elections, to encourage a party that has many factions and they're all showing up at this election. That's a better strategy for building your party and winning going forward. And then finally, the last thing I will say is, I think there are some interesting questions about the reforms to the parties, what they seek to accomplish, the primaries, what they seek to accomplish, and whether what effect they will have on the parties. And I think there's a lot of difference of opinion and discussion in this regard, but is it good for the parties or not good for the parties? In what way? In some ways, you do wonder whether some of the reforms would undermine parties, would have people elected who may be elected in cross-party coalitions who don't have responsibility to their kind of party and their electors, or sort of a little bit of a lack of clarity as to who the Republican candidate is, who the Democratic candidate is, or sometimes to emphasize divisions. I think the Alaska situation is not one that's easily transferable. I think there were a lot of particulars about the Alaska situation, but there's a certain way in which, with the mix of candidates you had, that this reform kind of drove a wedge in the Republican Party in a way. Maybe that's good for the Republican Party to have a conversation and think about what it needs to be, but on the other hand, it was certainly one that really had some divisive effects. And so again, is that a good thing for parties or a bad thing for parties? And then lastly, I think a separate question for things like ranked choice voting is, maybe should we consider them as, aside from the larger reforms, but should we consider them just within a traditional primary? Virginia, again, somewhat smaller electorate, but still had a ranked choice set of selections among a certain group of Republicans. And I just think some of those reforms will look very different in a multi-candidate race. You could say also in a Bears race of many candidates on one side, but even in a general primary where you have 3, 4, 5, 6 candidates, well, maybe there's a way which you want to have some sort of ranking or runoff system that would look different than one that interacts with the two-party system and potentially has impacts as well. So I'm going to leave that there.
Well, thank you, John. And for those who are following along without a playbook, ranked choice voting is where one does 1 through 5, and then there's the losers who don't make the final, have their votes transferred. You talked about the Alaska party, which is similar to that. So there's a lot of things that are in play. I have to say, I can remember when the West Virginia primary in 1960, which John F. Kennedy won, was kind of the first time that presidential primaries started to be a big thing. And then not that long after, we had Super Tuesday. And then this year, like most recent years, we have primaries rolling toward us from across the country. And that's why I want to bring Henry Olsen in on this conversation, who maybe as much as anybody, possibly as much as Karl Rove, looks at every county election. So Henry is very well versed in what's going on all around the country. And I think our core question for you, Henry, is, were primaries as important this year as we seem to think they were, and what were the ones that really got your attention?
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Howard. Primaries were decisive in a number of races this year, and I think, though, we should step back from it and ask ourselves why. That the primary system started as a way to remove power from bosses, broadly understood, and restore it to the people. But what they have evolved into is a way to accommodate multi-party politics into a two-party system. What do I mean by that? That we have stark political divisions in our country that in virtually every other place in the Western world would result in different parties. Even our neighbor to the north, Canada, which has, like us, a first-past-the-post single-member district system, has 5 significant parties that contest that. And the reason why is because losers or outsiders can't easily gain control of an established brand through the primary system and then use that brand to force a binary choice on perhaps unwilling voters. But that's what happens all the time here, is that if you're an outsider to the political system, you use the primary to seize the brand of an established party and become an insider. And it's exactly those cases that we saw the primaries become extremely decisive this year. The Republican Party is split, as all large parties in a two-party or any large party, even in a multi-party system, has significant factions. But what has happened since the Trump era is that the old factions, which were based on ideology, largely have, as I mentioned in my Washington Post column yesterday, become redefined over the question of where you stand on Donald Trump. And there are associated ideas that go along with that. To what extent should the old party ideas be represented as the party's platform? To what extent should the new deviations from the old Reaganite consensus be that platform? Across the country, we had Donald Trump involve himself in primaries, supporting candidates of like temperament and like deviation tendencies, fighting against oftentimes multiple candidates, but more often one significant candidate who largely represented what we could call the old guard, the people who wanted less deviations in style and substance. Most of the time, the Trump candidate won. Not all of the time, Georgia being the great example of where Trump tried to seize control through his minions of the Georgia Republican Party, and he lost resoundingly in virtually every effort. But most of the time, they were narrow victories, but Trumpist candidates won. What we saw, and this is where we get to the multi-party thesis, is that that did not mean that the losing faction in the Republican Party rejoined their party in the general election. And it did not mean that the people who do not participate in primaries, who are disproportionately less politically motivated and more politically independent, were willing to go along with the party choice. So what we saw is a number of cases, again, not exclusively. J.D. Vance won, and he won with the percentage that was nearly identical to Donald Trump's, even on a smaller turnout, 53% of the vote in Ohio. Or Ted Budd in North Carolina, who was elevated from being an obscure congressman to the next senator, largely because of Trump's endorsement. He won North Carolina in a very contested race with a slightly higher percentage of the vote than Trump managed to get. But in more cases than not, the Trumpist candidate lost. Kerry Lake in Arizona, Tim Michels in Wisconsin, Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania. And what you largely saw was a segment of people, both who are Republican-leaning independents and some Republican loyalists who would not go along with that choice. So in that sense, the Trumpist challenge, and perhaps the best example of that is actually one of the more obscure ones, which is Joe Kent, who is a uber-Trumpist. I was following him in the primary. I'm not sure he even had lived in the district before he moved there to challenge Jaime Herrera Butler, one of the 10 Republicans who voted to impeach Trump. This is a seat that's based on the city of Vancouver, which is a suburb of Portland across the Columbia River in no-income tax Washington. And he barely beat Herrera Butler in the Washington state all-party primary, where there was a lot of evidence that normally Democratic voters crossed over to support the pro-impeachment Republicans so that they had a more palatable choice. And what we found is that enough Republicans and independents didn't want the uber-Trumpists that they voted for the Democrat. And so we're now going to see a Democrat represent that district for the first time in over a decade. We even saw this in places that weren't strongly contested or thought to be competitive. Lauren Boebert barely won re-election in a district that Trump won by 7 points. Marjorie Taylor Greene swept to victory, but she ran about 8 points below Trump on the margin. Again, showing that even in safe Republican districts, there's a certain number of people who will not vote for the uber-Trumpist candidate under any circumstances. But it's not a uniparty phenomenon. What we also saw is that the factional battles that are riveting the Democratic Party and that will become more important rather than less important over time cost the Democrats a couple of seats as well. And the primary example for that is a congressional district in Oregon where a woman named Jamie Lode Skinner defeated a blue dog moderate Democrat, Kurt Schrader. And this is a seat that President Biden won by 8 points. And it turned out that Lode Skinner, who ran as what Howard Dean would have called 20 years ago, the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party, and is today considered strongly progressive, turned off people in her party and independents. And the Republican, Lori Chavez DeRemer, a mayor of Happy Valley, Oregon, is going to be the new representative. Andrea Salinas was a state rep in a neighboring district, also representing the progressive wing. The Republican there, Biden won by 10 points, and Salinas won by 2. Basically the same 8-9 point shift. It just happened to be that seat was a little bit more Democratic. And in Pittsburgh, you saw a battle between Summer Lee, a strongly progressive Democratic Socialist of America candidate, a new member of the squad, winning a tight primary over a more moderate Democrat. She ran against in a Biden plus 20 district, won by 12 points against the Republican, who For those of you who like the Eddie Murphy movie, The Distinguished Gentleman was the name you know. He had the same name as the outgoing Democratic Congressman, Mike Doyle. But again, the same 8-point shift. 8-point shift here, 8-point shift there. Kind of suggests that there's a significant part of the electorate that doesn't like extremes, that is not registered in party primaries, and that should temper the enthusiasm of the more aggressive faction in putting their candidates forward. But what we know is that since this is a way to mediate multi-party politics, is that won't happen because there's no alternative to fighting in party primaries if you're trying to establish influence. And if you lose a couple on the way to winning others, well, that's just the price of the game. And if, like with the Trumpist faction, you lose more than you can win, not fighting means you lose completely. So it is a feature of our system that is virtually not extant in any other country in the world. And it's one I think that will increasingly be important for our politics as the minority faction of the parties increasingly wins these primaries on the basis of mobilizing their more fervent supporters and consequently poses more unpalatable choices for a key decisive swing segment of the electorate.
Thank you, Henry. That is a lot to chew on. And I want you to, if you would, reinforce your very opening line, which is mediate a multi-party system and funnel it into two parties. Is that an accurate description?
Absolutely. We have multi-party politics in this country. They just take place within the contours of two official parties.
Right. And so and now I'm going to turn to some Q&A. I'm going to start Qing and they're going to start Aing. But I want to invite our audience members here and online. Can somebody tell me what our Twitter handle is? How do they do it? Go onto the AAI website and figure it out.
Real quick, the Twitter handle is hashtag AI primary, if you'd like to send in questions.
Hashtag AAI primary. Okay. Henry, I'm now going to push us a little bit toward what we think should happen, if anything, to change this system. And what I get out of your remarks, is that, well, we have a very competitive system. It's not really a broken system. It's reflecting choices. They're very contested primaries that may have smaller slices of the electorate, but to the extent that they come up with unpalatable choices, they'll be punished in November. So reforms may be solutions in search of a problem. Is that your view?
The question we need to ask is, do we want to channel multi-party politics into a two-party system, or do we want to have multiple parties? If we want the two-party system where parties coalesce under another banner and then factional conflicts are fought out in public in primaries and in private when these members negotiate legislative agenda, then we shouldn't change anything at all. But if we think that we would be healthier if we had a multi-party system where parties presented coherent platforms that competed with one another more directly, then we need to completely upfund the primary system. Because the open primary system means there is little incentive to form a serious alternative party because it is cheaper for an outside group to compete to seize the brand of an in-group than it is to set up a whole new infrastructure. Just think, if you were a hamburger entrepreneur and you could, the hamburger industry is like a closed system. You can't get your hamburgers put on the McDonald's menu. So you have to create your own brand, your own infrastructure, and it's hard. And in politics, in business, if you get a 4% share of the market, you're a millionaire. And in politics, if you get a 4% share of the market, you're a loser. So what do these hamburger entrepreneurs do in politics? They go through the primary system to get their burgers put on the McDonald's menu. That's what Donald Trump did. That's what progressives do. That's what the left wing of the Democratic Party did in the 1970s. It's what the conservative movement did from the 60s through the 80s. This is now a 60-year pattern where outsiders use the primary system, become insiders over time by seizing the established brand and replacing the offerings.
Right.
And so the question is, what do we want?
I just want to press
keep what
Henry
we've
really
got.
briefly before I get to John. If you had to choose between opening the primaries and upending the system as we know it?
I think the nation would be better served with a multi-party system than the current system. I think it would be more coherent. I think it would allow for governing to take place on a more effective level. It doesn't matter who has the majority in the Senate or Congress because it's a multi-party system. They don't get elected to enact an agenda. And so I think the system would be better if we had a multi-party system so that
okay.
the issues and the factions were out in public display.
Right, and obviously that would obviate a lot of the rest of our discussion this morning, so we're going to bracket that. But John, go ahead.
So first of all, I will say I would buy the Henry Olsen burger. So you know, if you're going to go into that market, I think maybe there's something there. But pushing against that point, of course, and you hinted at this as well, multi-party systems have their would actually have a similar dynamic if you had open primaries. The larger parties have factions themselves. The parties shift and change, and the way we select candidates or select the leaders, if we allow the people to vote, then it allows some sort of capture in all these cases, or there are different factions within these parties. So, and one thing you've seen, just again, if you look at European parliamentary systems, where in many cases there have been fairly dominant parties at on either side, the percentage of the vote that they're getting in the elections it has dropped dramatically since World War II, right? It's sort of slowly going down in a mishmash of parties, and so it's not easy to see how that system isn't also affected by this. I mean, the argument you could make, which Henry, you make, maybe you think it's a bad thing, but is that there's a certain way in which the primaries and letting the people speak keeps a party honest and keeps it closer to what you need to get a majority, in the sense that entrepreneurs can take over, and if the old party bosses and the leaders and the old stale candidates of the past have been kind of ignoring issues or ignoring the changes in their electorate and their voters, that is resolved more easily in a primary system eventually. And I think one thing we see here, while our parties change, they get captured, they adjust. In other countries, you sometimes see the fall of major parties, just disappearance of parties overnight, and that's partly because they are not really connected the way to the people. So I think your point about these entrepreneurs coming in, that's I think what people are worried about, and they're sometimes worried about particular entrepreneurs, and especially if the entrepreneurs really, the model is that they are going to create a system where they only are really representing kind of 40% of the American people, and they're willing to lose a bunch of elections because they get control of the party. I'm not positive that's what happens. I mean, I think there's a question of whether over time voters don't start to think, well, we need to be a little more concerned about winning, right? That comes up in the context. I think the Democratic primary in some ways in 2020 was partly about that. Democratic voters could have had some choices who were more progressive. They thought, in part, well, who could win? That's a system of the health of this. So I don't disagree with many of the criticism and my comments before of thinking about parties wanting to have broader electorates and encouraging their primary turnouts. That is a way, I think, of further keeping the parties honest and making sure that you are not having a really small slice of the electorate be the ones who elect the candidate, right? But the openness, the ability of the voters to speak keeps the parties a little more in tune with what American politics is, and keeps the stale old leaders and parties falling away from happening.
So John, and I want to get to Kevin quickly too, and then I want to get to the audience, but Henry put his chips down on multi-party because he says we have a kind of a fake multi-party system now, and it creates distortions. You seem to be saying, no, we have a competitive system, and it should be reformed to have more voters involved. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, and I, look, I think at any point, a multi-party system or two-party system, in some ways the end goal is to have a majority to govern or get a government. And whether you get it from some coalition later or in advance, I think the two-party system has a lot of virtues to it, and it's difficult to figure out how to pick the candidates, but an open system that allows the basic voters of the two potential majorities to really pick good candidates, I think with some reforms is generally.
And those basic voters may not be registered party members?
Yeah, I generally am very much in favor of opening the electorate widely, encouraging people to come in. And I know we have this election, and this has been talk of the Democratic Party supporting some very Trumpy candidates. Did it work exactly? I mean, some of these candidates got elected, and some of the times it was very close. In general, I think the history of America is it doesn't work that well. It's hard to get people to strategically vote. Usually people pay some penalty for being so open about it. Maybe this election makes us doubt that a little bit more, but I still think that's generally true. I wouldn't worry so much that there'd be some Democrats coming over to a Republican primary and independents. If you really have a broad slice of people in there, those people are going to be somewhat diluted, and the party members.
I expect we'll hear some pushback on that in our second panel. But Kevin, I want to push you, having offered our analysis and heard kind of contrasting views. Henry saying the system operates well in some ways, but I would really prefer a much more logical system. And John saying, well, no, things are working pretty well. With some tweaks, would work better. Do you have a choice between those, or do you have a whole other choice?
Well, I'm still grappling with the whole confusing mess of it. I mean, we've been experimenting with these primaries for 100 years, and obviously the way they've been run is very diverse, and the demographies in which they're run are very diverse. You know, if you have kind of a largely monoculture or small district, you know, how you run your elections and the results you're going to get will be very different from if you had a very polyglot one and you run that exact same system. So I tend to resist the idea that there's like a one fix method for dealing with things. But kind of beneath that is the question I have about the results. Are we getting legislators? And that's my thing. Congress is my thing. We'll leave aside executives and city councils and all that. Are we getting legislators at the national level who have incentives to govern? Mm-hmm. And my concern with the primary system is that often no. You get elected to the House of Representatives, you know you have to run that gauntlet in 2 years, and what do you have to do? You have to survive the primary. And the first thing you do is you worry about being primaried from the left if you're a Democrat, or primaried from the right if you're a Republican. And the extra variable that we've seen thrown in the last few years is you have to worry about upsetting a certain former president if you're in the GOP. And that doesn't align well with, like, how do you come to here and break bread in this, beautiful dome down the road with people from all over the country who represent diverse districts and, diverse people. The other factor is in the background, and I'm so glad Henry brought up the multi-party democracy and a two-party system idea. We had a two-party system that was much more accommodating to multi-party democracy. I mean, many of us are old enough to remember liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, and that often created sort of cross-partisan bargaining opportunities within Congress. Now we've had this kind of nationalization of the two parties, and it trickles down to the lower level. And so, whereas in many districts people should be talking about local things, water rights or other sort of local issues, they're debating how closely they are aligned with various national positions that have been staked out by the party. And that's kind of crowding out and creating a whole incentive structure so that people come here just with their arms tied behind their back. They can't break bread with on some of the most pressing issues of the day, be it immigration, budget reform, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's kind of how I approach this. And I think there's going to be a lot of reforms that need to be tried in a lot of places, and we're going to have to collect a lot of data and see how it works.
It's really a fascinating point you've made. We could say that Henry and John, at the instigation of the title of this program, have focused on process, and you're focusing on, are we getting the government we need? And of course, those are intimately related, but you've put your emphasis on the latter. I once ran for local office and was told by a wise older woman in the town, there are two types of candidates, those who want to run and those who want to serve. And I think you've highlighted that difference. Okay, I want to get some questions from the audience. I know we've got some distinguished people in this group. Please identify yourself, tell us where you're from, and put your question in the form of a question. Right here in the middle, and wait for the microphone, would you?
Good morning, thank you. John Ward, Yahoo News. Nice to see all of you this morning. Henry, you mentioned multi-party system, and I came in late, so I may have missed it. But what's your preferred method for getting there? And is the system that they are now using in Alaska a way of doing that, or is it actually going to maybe act as a pressure valve to decrease the popular demand for alternatives to the two-party system?
And Henry, would you kind of very briefly summarize the Alaska situation for those who might not know it?
Yeah, the Alaska situation is that you have an all-party primary in the summer where every candidate of any different party or no party can compete, and you vote for one person. The top four in that then move on to the general election, regardless of party. So you could theoretically have 4 Democrats or 4 Republicans make it to the top 4. They all compete in what's called a ranked choice voting system, where the voter has the option of choosing only one or as many as 4 in the order of their preference. And then you eliminate the lowest person who receives the fewest amount of votes, reallocate their votes to the next preference until somebody gets a majority of the vote. That's the Alaska.
So it's a combination of a so-called jungle preliminary with ranked choice.
Correct. Jungle preliminary with the ranked choice system. That is the one that Alaska has. My preference would be, if I could just wave a wand, would be we eliminate party primaries altogether. If you want to have a party primary, it has to be done like it is done in the countries, in most of the rest of the world, not all, but most of the rest of the world that has primaries. They are done by the parties themselves and are limited to dues-paying members. So that's how, like, the Republicans in France select their nominees. But what that means is that the party people, as defined by the leaders or by the broad voting populace of dues-paying members, are the party. And if you're not part of that, you form a new party. And you can't get a multi-party system unless you have a closed selection system to people who currently call themselves members of that party.
And so in answer to the gentleman's question, you would have that as a prequel to having a multi-party system.
It would have to be that way. You can't get a multi-party. We had multi-parties in the United States before the introduction of primaries. The Populist Party of the 1890s, the creation of multiple parties and the messy breakdown of the Democrats and the Whigs in the press, before we get to the formation of Republicans and Democrats in the pre-Civil War period. Those were possible because you had a closed nomination system. People got together and they said, we're Republicans, and then we select who our Republican candidate is. And if you're not part of that, you go and form another party, like the American Party or the Constitutional Union Party. And you have multiple closed systems. That's how you get a multi-party system. You can't have a multi-party system if you have an open ability to seize the mantle of a party that's outside of the control of the people who identify as the most active members of that party. And that's what we have today, is where there's no incentive to form a serious third party. So I do not believe Alaska or Maine's ranked choice system will lead to serious third parties, because the incentives all along the way are to try and seize the mantle of that party group and hope that you're broad enough appeal to coalesce most of that party group. And if you're not, maybe you rely on ranked choice to get you over the line of 50%. But unless we eliminate party primaries that are open to large, you see, where we might have our only disagreement is, I think the people ultimately have the choice. The question is, should they have the choice within the context of a two-party system, so that broad parties that have multiple factions are a more effective way of governing? Or do we actually have a more effective way of governing and increasing popular involvement through a multi-party system? I think the latter is true, but I'm not a crusader.
And you would
for
argue that that would fulfill Kevin's goal of having candidates who are more interested in serving.
If I've written a piece on Kevin McCarthy. I write this piece every couple of years, which is say, think of yourself as in a multi-party system. If you're Kevin McCarthy and you've got 222 members, what you should do is have a coalition agreement. The House Freedom Caucus is effectively trying to act as a different party. They should think of themselves as a different party. And what happens in multi-party politics is, to form the government, you actually have to bargain, and you create a document and say, this is what we'll do, this is what we won't do, and it gets organized. What we've got right now is, since nobody thinks of themselves that way, nobody organizes, and you're constantly going through, well, is AOC going to vote for this, or is this, and what's their price, and what's their payoff? Multi-party bargaining gets away with all of that because you do the hard work up front.
I think Kevin McCarthy might be doing some bargaining right now, but that's just, yes, sir, on the right there, and tell us who you are and any affiliation that might be relevant.
Sure. Eric Bam, I'm with Reason Magazine. Henry, big fan. I think this is mostly right. I want to just push back on like one little bit of your analysis.
As a libertarian, I would expect
yeah,
you would.
well, right, of course. So I am bringing that perspective to this question. To go back to your hamburger metaphor, it's the one problem with that metaphor is that if you want to start a new hamburger company in politics, McDonald's and Burger King have like an easier way, you know, they get on the ballot automatically in a lot of states, whereas your new hamburger company doesn't get to compete in the same market. So not only do you have to go through the process of setting up a new hamburger chain and attracting customers, but like the bar to entry is actually even higher than it is for the incumbents. And so I wonder, going back now more recently to what you just said about like you don't see how the Alaska or Maine changes create a mechanism to actually do away with the two-party system. Like, I don't know how this other change you're proposing comes to pass either, because there's literally no incentive for elected officials, Republicans and Democrats in states, to vote to change their voting laws. Is there, given that they've got a built-in incumbency advantage at the moment? Why would they demolish that?
Well, first of all, Alaska's system came into being because of a voter initiative. Had it been up to the people in the two parties, they wouldn't have changed the system. In fact, the Alaska Republican Party campaigned against it. No, if you have a system without voter initiative, you would have to form a party on that basis and win election. That's how it happened in California in 1910. The Progressive Party formed as a third party in the pre-primary age and said, we need to break the rule of Republican Party power bosses. And they won an election, and they changed the election laws to allow for party primaries, voter initiative, referendum, recall of officers. That's how change happened. And so for libertarians, I think libertarians do have access in many states. And most states provide fundamental access to people who are able to show either a minimum level of registered voters in states with party registration or a minimum level of support on a statewide election. The reason libertarians don't have ballot access in many states is because they don't hit that level, which is often as low as like 1%. So if you can't get 1 out of 100 people to affiliate with you, you've got a bigger problem than ballot access.
I mean, I would just add that there are ballot access questions have always been a question. There's some states that are more strict than others. But there are plenty of other non-legal barriers, right? I mean, the fact that you're a small party trying to compete with these already existing brands, back to the burger metaphor. I mean, technically, the Alaska system, for example, would allow an individual who call themselves of a party or just an independent to get on the ballot, get in there, get in front of the voters. So it is a sort of reduction of the ballot, but a reduction of the entry barriers. But I guess the one thing, getting back to Henry's point about Alaska or any other system, the systems themselves are not the only thing happening, right? The parties are going to interact with those reforms. And in Alaska, I mean, I think we had a particularly extreme form of division in the Republican Party, especially in the House race. Mary Peltola, who was a good candidate in many ways, probably had some cross-party appeal. But on the Republican side, you effectively had 2 candidates who made it impossible for a Republican to win because they weren't going to have their voters vote for the other Republican. In fact, some of them signaled that they would vote for the Democrat ahead. And so it could exacerbate those problems. But in a different context, parties sometimes get their act together and they clear the primaries and they tap someone and say, this is the person who's going to be the candidate, and they make sure that no one else is there to run against them. So how they interact, so these reforms could look very different in different states depending on what the parties end up doing with them. And I think some of those reforms could be good or bad, but it's not clear that it's going to be a universal effect putting them in place.
Well, we're at time for our first panel. Join me in thanking Kevin Kosar, Henry Olsen, and John Fortier. I'm Howard Husock, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm joined by a whole new group, and our format for this second panel is going to move in more closely to our current situation. We're going to have a strong advocate for specific forms of change, and then we're going to have reactions from people who are in the arena, as it is said, with the Democratic Republican parties in response to his proposals. So on my right is our firebrand for this particular panel. I'm sure you're all going to be firebrands, but John Updike is joining us from Open Primaries, which is the name of his group based in New York. He's an activist and strategist with 25 years of experience in independent, alternative, and reform politics. He's been a fundraiser. He's been a party activist with neither Democratic nor Republican parties. Is that right? Okay. So, and John is going to make a strong pitch for a particular approach. To my second right is Ben Ginsberg. He's the Volcker Distinguished Fellow at the Hoover Institution and a nationally known political law advocate representing participants in the political process. Bush v. Gore? Yeah. So that would be the political process. Michael Ginsberg is an attorney in Washington, D.C., practicing in national security law. He also is the chairman, more relevant for these purposes, the 11th Congressional District Committee of the Republican Party of Virginia and the Republican Party of Virginia's Executive Committee. He was very involved in the nomination process in the last gubernatorial election in Virginia, which had some prominent consequences. And finally, Elaine Kamarck is a senior fellow in the Governance Studies program, as well as the director of the Center for Effective Public Management at the Brookings Institution. She's the author of Primary Politics, Everything You Need to Know About How America Nominates Its Presidential Candidates. So she's going to be the only one who speaks, actually, because she has everything, you know. She has also been a lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and has been actively involved in 4 presidential campaigns and 10 nominating conventions. So that would be in the arena. So I want to start with, on my far right, John Updike of Open Primaries. What's Open Primaries all about, and what do you have in mind?
Sure, thank you. It's great to be here, and welcome to everyone watching in the live stream. I founded Open Primaries in 2009 after spending 20 plus years in the third party movement. And that was an incredibly growthful learning experience. One of the things I learned, which anybody who gets involved in the third party movement, the alternative politics movement, learns, is the extent that the Democratic and Republican parties have instituted themselves not just as McDonald's and Burger King, not just as the biggest organizations of politics. They literally control the process itself. Everything from the presidential debates to the federal election commissioner to secretaries of state to ballot access to campaign finance, you name it. We live in a constructed two-party system, not a free market two-party system. So in that context, one of the things I learned from organizing people into alternative parties was that there is a growing, somewhat hidden, waiting to be born constituency of Americans that do not like political parties. They're not looking for a two-party system. They're not looking for a 9-party system. They're looking for a system in which parties have the right to exist. They're not looking to ban parties, but that we have a democracy that is not controlled by the competitors, that there is some firewall between the political parties and the government. So open primaries is a wedge. It's a tactic. It's an opportunity to raise a conversation in the country about what is the appropriate and the inappropriate role for political parties. I argue that political parties should be competitors. They should not be making the rules of the game. They should not be controlling the rules of the game. No American should be required to join a private organization in order to vote in a publicly funded, publicly administered election. And that's what the primaries are. The primaries are not these kind of closed elections where the parties determine who their nominee is. They're publicly funded, publicly administered elections that are designed to winnow the candidates from round A to round B. And as Kevin Kosar put, I think very eloquently, that's a mess, and it's very obscured, and it's not clear. Different states do it in different ways. And the parties, by virtue of having become so synonymous with government, it's very hard to see it. So open primaries is a wedge. It's a way to create a conversation about how do we get out of this mess that we're in.
And John, what would an open primary be? What's your specific prescription?
Well, I'm very unpopular in this regard, in that to use what Henry was saying in that previous panel, if I had a magic wand, I would break the magic wand. I don't believe in determining that in advance. I think citizens should say, what do we want in an electoral system? What are our goals? What are our desires? I think the direction of that is that I advocate for, and that some people listen to, is a nonpartisan system, where if the parties want to get together on their own time and their own dime and determine which candidates they prefer, they should do that. This is a free country. But the process itself should be nonpartisan. We have that in California with the top 2. We have that in Alaska with the top 4. We have that in Nebraska, where they have a nonpartisan legislature, completely nonpartisan, from the primary election to how they caucus in the assembly. I don't think there's a single model that is preferable to others. I think that the process of the citizenry getting together and saying, let's look at our options, how can we improve this, that's the most important thing here.
Okay, so I'm going to try to summarize here because I want to have something on the table for our other panelists. What I get out of that is that you would favor what Kevin called a runoff, Henry called a jungle primary, right? A preliminary election in which the parties could endorse candidates, but they didn't run that election.
Exactly.
Okay, and that would be how and then you're agnostic about whether there would be ranked choice voting or there would be a final 4 on the November ballot. That you would leave up to the individual states or municipalities for that matter.
Exactly.
Okay, so I want to get some reactions here, and I'm going to just jump around and go right to Elaine Kamarck, if I might, because I know that you and she have disagreed about this in the past. And so, as somebody who is a strong Democratic Party activist, what do you think?
I don't think you can have democracies without political parties. I don't think it's feasible. I think that, first of all, people organize themselves by parties. The reason third parties never get any place, the reason independents never get any place, is because what's an independent? What is it? Nobody knows. Okay, people call themselves independents. They don't know what it is. Parties are a shorthand for voters understanding democracy. So, if you call yourself a Republican, it means probably you kind of like low taxes and you don't think the government should be in business very much, and it kind of screws things up in business. If you call yourself a Democrat, you kind of think that the government ought to help out people, more than it's doing, or help out people to a certain extent. Parties are critical to democracies, and maybe as we spoke before, maybe multi-party systems work, but you have to have parties, because otherwise democracy doesn't mean anything, and otherwise you don't know what you're voting for and what you're likely to get. So I don't think it's very realistic to go to all nonpartisan stuff. The second point is, I take your point about the parties organizing the system, but who else would do it? In other words, the system is not organized by the parties, it's organized by state legislatures. It's state legislatures that vote to fund a primary, create a primary, et cetera. And then within those primaries, the parties decide what they're going to do. So in Republican presidential primaries, it's more or less a winner-take-all system by by county or by congressional district. In a democratic system, it's a proportional system by congressional district. In other words, the parties have leeway, but it's the state legislature that says, we're going to have a primary and we're going to pay, it's on this date and we're going to pay for it. Now, I don't know how you would set up a nomination system if you took all the parties out of it, because the state legislatures are composed of parties and they get together to create a system. Who would do it? I just don't, I don't see how you can get into this totally nonpartisan world, because somebody's got to do it.
Well, let's split the difference here for a minute, and then I'm going to get to Michael and Ben. But there's also the possibility of having more or less open party primaries. And I know that you and John actually disagreed about this in the context of the Democratic platform. So the Democrats could run a primary, the Republicans run a primary. They already have different rules. You just reminded us
Yeah,
that
they already have different rules.
proportional representation, well, that's a big deal, right? So would you want the Democratic primary to be open to independents or some other tweak of that kind?
Well, let me put a little nuance on this current situation. All right, there's about 30, 31 states that have registration by political party. However, that is not as restrictive as it seems. In New York, it is. In New York, it's very hard to vote in a primary because you have to, so New Yorkers always get this
In
view of the world.
February, you have to change.
Yeah, you have to change way ahead of the primary date. Most states in the United States, particularly a lot of southern states, a lot of the Midwestern states, you may register by party, but guess what? On election day, you go up and you say, I want a Democratic or a Republican ballot. And that deems you to have changed your registration. But it's not as closed as it was, say, 50 years ago when you had a lot of party machines and you really had registration by party. New York is kind of an outlier in terms of the states. Every place else, it's a lot easier to go vote in somebody else's primary.
And so you like that?
Yeah, I do like that. I think this current system gives flexibility for people to move into a primary of the other party. I think that as Henry was talking about, we saw in this last one, there were clearly Democrats moving into the, voting for Republicans, voting in Republican primaries and vice versa. That happens because the system's pretty porous. It's pretty easy to do that. And New York being a big outlier in the country.
Right, and so open primaries and other tweaks are, to use a phrase I used earlier, a solution in search of a problem?
Sort of. I mean, look, we had a big to-do inside the Democratic Party some years ago with the Unity Commission, because the Bernie people felt that the party registration really hurt their chances. And so New York made some adjustments in its party registration. But I think it's more or less a solution in terms of search of a problem.
All right, we've heard from a Democrat, and we have two Republicans. So we're going to turn first to Ben Ginsberg, who's been, I want to say, an election-related attorney. Is that true?
I am related to elections, yes.
Yeah. Right. So do you take a different position from the Republican point of view than your counterpart from the Democrats is taking here?
Well, personally, no, I don't. And I find the conversation about open and closed primaries not terribly meaningful. I should say that the Republican Party itself in 2020 passed a rule, and I think it hadn't gotten much attention, which closes off the presidential primary to registered Republicans. Now, that's a pretty drastic move in favor of closed primaries.
That's a platform position, and obviously it doesn't
It's not a
govern all the
platform
states.
committee, it's
It's
a
a rules
Republican
committee.
National Committee rule.
But does
So
it govern the states?
Yeah, it covers the conducting of primaries, yes.
So no Republican primary per the National Party could now be a quote-unquote open primary?
Correct. The way the rule reads is that you have to be a registered, they're calling you now. They have to be a registered Republican, or in the non-registration states, give some proof of their affiliation with the Republican Party. So for presidential purposes, the Republican National Committee, in all its wisdom and based on its really stellar results in the last 3 elections, has decided to close it off. But they're really mad. But it's worth looking at the nominees produced in this past election by open versus closed primaries. So just looking at sort of the battleground states where there were real Trump candidates on the ballot, closed states included Nevada, the Senate and Secretary of State, and Pennsylvania governor and senator. Didn't work so well. The open primary states also didn't work so well, right? So Arizona with governor, Senate, and Secretary of State, New Hampshire Senate, Ohio Senate, and the Michigan and Wisconsin governors. So whether it's an open or closed primary can still produce the same affiliated candidates. So I'm not sure that the whole discussion over open or closed is what you need to get at and discuss to get at the question of what you want to be.
Okay,
as
so I'll
a
push you
voting
on
class.
prescriptions. We have John Updike with a specific prescription, nonpartisan preliminaries. Elaine has pushed back against that, and you're saying, where should we go?
Well, I mean, I'm saying I don't think the Republican or closed primary matters, and I actually don't kind of like the kind of artificial game changes of jungle primaries and top 5. I think where you should go is actually back to what voting and democracy is all about, which is increased turnout of more moderate voters to produce results you like, instead of trying to change the rules. I think this is a sort of a difficult time for the country in terms of polarization generally, but the real answer to it is democratic, public, small d democratic, public mobilization of more voters to come into the system.
Well, I thought that's what John was saying open primaries was going to do, was to bring more moderate
But the
voters
point
in
in
at
the
the
point
preliminary stage.
But the point in reading that list to you is that the open primaries did not produce more moderate candidates. So that's why I think it's kind of I'm not sure it's the real argument here.
Right. Okay, now we have the representative from the smoke-filled room. Right? As close as we come to a smoke-filled room today, Michael Ginsberg, talk about what you worked to do in Virginia that led to the election of Governor Glenn Youngkin. You engaged in the primary process through a nominating convention. Please inform those who might not know what happened, and then tell us why you thought it was a good idea.
Sure. So I sit on and sat from 2020, starting in 2020, on the State Central Committee of the Republican Party of Virginia, which is the governing body of the
You
state
really call
party.
it the Central Committee?
The State Central Committee. We're not the only ones. There are a lot of states that call them state central committees, even though everybody says it sounds Stalinist. But it is what we call it. And just to be clear, I'm only speaking for myself, not for the committee or for the Republican Party of Virginia. But when we sat down at the end of 2020 and we said, how are we going to nominate our candidates, our statewide candidates, in 2021? How are we going to do this? Our thought, my thought as a party leader, our goal was, how can we get the most competitive Republican candidate? Sitting here as a partisan, how do we get our most competitive Republican candidate? In Virginia, the party can actually choose the method of nomination. You can choose a primary, and if you choose a primary, it's run by the state, and it's open. There's no party registration in Virginia, so anybody could come and vote in it. Or you can choose a party-run process. The party-run process is paid for by the party counts the ballots, the party does the whole thing, and then just tells the state, here's our nominee. And so we had to decide between those options. In a party-run process, you can do a convention, or you can do what they call a canvass. But the
But
real
you had those options.
we did have those options, yes. Those were really the three options on the table. Really the two options were the primary, which is run by the state, or the convention, which was run by the party.
Real quick, Ben, how common is that type of option at the state level?
It's universal.
Universal,
It's
anybody?
universal. Yeah, it's universal. I mean, the Supreme Court says parties are protected.
Parties win on First Amendment
yeah, that-
associational rights.
Freedom of
on any
association.
of these things.
Any party in the Democrat or Republican, any party in any state can pick to go with a state-run primary or have some
Right.
kind of convention or a party-run primary.
Right, so
Right.
we could go back to more emphasize conventions, and that's what we did. Keep going.
So, yeah, so in the case of a convention, so the question really was for us as a party, how do you get a consensus GOP candidate? What's the most competitive candidate? In my view, in the view of a lot of the majority of the committee that ended up voting for a convention, it was, to get a consensus GOP candidate who also could appeal to independents, maybe some swing voters, maybe some Democrats in what is a purple state, Virginia. And so how were we going to do that? Well, we knew as of 2020, we took this vote in December of 2020, we knew we were going to have a wide field. There were anywhere from 6 to 10 candidates looking at running. And of those candidates, there were a couple that are sort of what I would call a high floor, low ceiling candidate. These are candidates that had rock-ribbed support from, say, 20 to 30% of the voters, but they were not going to be able to, certainly were not going to be able to grow outside of the party if they were the nominee, and couldn't really grow within the party. I mean, they had their supporters and that was it. And essentially they were counting on the plurality of a primary to get past the nomination and to get the nomination.
A split field.
A split field, a plurality vote, you get your 30% and you move on. We also had, and to be honest, we were concerned about the possibility of mischief from the other party, whether it was money spent to boost some of these weaker candidates or because it was open primaries, somebody coming in and voting, crossing over to vote. And of course, another concern that we had.
So they could cross over to vote in Virginia.
Absolutely, they could, for governor, yes. So they could do that, and lieutenant governor and attorney general. And the final concern that we had, and this was one that played out in 2022, was outsiders with limited feel for the state and the personalities and the candidates would come in and endorse somebody and maybe get them that 1 or 2% that would get them the nomination. You saw that in Pennsylvania, right? You had Dr. Oz wins by 0.2% over David McCormick. And look, there were a lot of Republicans, a lot of Trump Republicans that were dismayed by that endorsement and didn't come home and cost Oz in that nomination or in the general. We didn't want that to happen. We wanted a consensus candidate. And we struck upon a convention that used ranked choice voting. And
So two things. You went to the convention and you
Yes.
went to a convention where the delegates were voting via ranked choice.
Ranked choice voting. And the reason we liked ranked choice voting, and this is something we'd given a lot of thought to, was, when you get a plurality primary, right, you've got somebody who wins with 30%. Well, they get the 30% support that person. What you don't know, what the primary won't tell you, is how the other 70% feel about that candidate. Are they indifferent to that candidate? Are they satisfied with that candidate? Are they so dismayed by that candidate they're not going to work for him, they're not going to donate, they might not even vote, they might go support Republican for the Democrat organization? You don't know. Ranked choice tells you. Because ranked choice will get you have to get to 50 plus 1. In a convention, you have to get to 50 plus 1. And in our, essentially it's an instant runoff, they call it. You vote once, but you do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You come out and you get a consensus candidate. Somebody gets to 50%. And that was huge for the party because number one, it ensured that multi-party battle within the, intra-party poll battle was resolved, and it was resolved in a way that led to enough people being satisfied with the candidate that they could close ranks around that candidate fairly quickly, and we did.
Close ranks. So the losing candidates in this convention, the potentially losing candidates agreed that they would not run in November. Is that correct?
They couldn't. They were unable to because I think Virginia has sort of a sore loser law. So they could not get onto the ballot if they stayed. One of the
Ben is leading in.
This was a really unique convention, though, because how many delegates did you have?
So this is the beauty of this convention, and it may not be replicable, but because of COVID, we couldn't assemble in a big hall, right? We just couldn't do it. We weren't allowed to. But the Republican Party plan, the bylaws of the party, allowed for what's called an unassembled convention, where people could vote in their localities, essentially, and not have to come to some central location. So essentially, it was a drive-through convention. We had 30 sites across the state. People drove through, ranked their ballots 1 through whatever for each of the 3 statewide races, the governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general. They passed them in. We shipped them all down to Richmond, and we counted them in the ballroom of the Richmond Marriott. So we had 60,000 people sign up to be delegates. You had to pre-file to be a delegate. So this was sort of a self-selected group of knowledgeable folks. You didn't have to be sort of an inside. It wasn't a completely smoke-filled room. And we have had over 30,000 people actually vote. It's probably the largest voting convention in American political history.
Kind of like a
But
caucus.
that's why it may not be replicable.
Right, go ahead.
Because Virginia usually has ranked choice voting. It's just in a 10,000 delegate convention where the rules amount to ranked choice voting as well.
Well, yeah.
And the makeup of the electorate traditionally in Virginia is far different than you had this time because you had COVID and you were able to expand it out.
So
the
for
question
those
is,
who might not know what ranked choice voting is as it's an attempt to get somebody to more than 50%.
Right.
And so as the lower tiered candidates clearly drop out, are winnowed out, their votes are transferred to their second, third, or fourth choices until somebody comes out on top.
Right.
And that's what happened at your quote-unquote convention.
Now, what we could have done, and the party plan would have allowed for this, is to do a canvass. And in a canvass, you have a voting site in every county and city. We decided not to do that because it would have been 140-some sites, but we could have done that where everybody, opened it up like that too. And you can always change the rules of the convention, right? So you can say anybody can show up, and you can have an unassembled convention. The party can do whatever it wants, or you could always have a primary that's both closed and ranked choice voting. So if you're looking for a way to sort of hybridize a lot of this, you could have a closed primary with ranked choice voting that does all the things we're talking about. It resolves the multi-party conflicts. It allows for Republicans or people who align with the Republican or the Democratic Party to vote, but it also gets you consensus nominees that aren't in it for building a social media profile or building anything else like that.
Okay, I want to push this back on John Updike now because we've heard 2 very important points. We heard from Ben Ginsberg that candidates in open primary states did not necessarily fare well for the Republican Party. So there's no inevitable moderation that comes from open primaries. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, open primaries produced even more Trump candidates than closed primaries.
Okay, so if the goal is less polarization, that may not be the ticket. And then we heard from Michael Ginsberg that the parties can adapt. The parties are not,
they're not
stuck
static.
in mud, that they recognize the need for more involvement and more moderate candidates, consensus candidates is the phrase you keep using, and so they're adapting. Does that convince you that we don't need these grander process changes?
No.
Well, tell us why.
Well, it's in some ways part of what all this discussion is giving expression to is that the political parties have enormous flexibility in how they nominate their candidates. That is true, and that's gone all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has said if the purpose of a primary is to nominate a candidate, the party can trump state election rules. I think the more thorny question, the more difficult question is, do we want an electoral system where the desires and goals and and aims of the political parties are identical to the election system? I argue no. I think there should be a public election system where people can run for office and not have to have their political journey completely over-determined by the political parties. Whether that's
But don't the parties just want to get people elected?
Sure, they do. But again, and these are difficult issues.
Okay.
I think that there is a strong case to be made that the two-party system provided a kind of dynamic stability for this country, particularly after World War II, that has been unprecedented in terms of its level of prosperity and also ability to absorb new issues, new controversies, new agenda into a national political dialogue. Part of what's happening in the country right now is that more and more Americans are saying the parties are not providing stability. They're the problem. The parties are destabilizing America. They're involving us all in this 24-hour war that is polarizing the country, that is preventing any meaningful progress on a wide range of issues, and that is driving people mentally ill because it's so divisive and negative.
Why do you single out the parties as culprits? This is a broad discussion in the country. Social media, celebrity candidates. Why are the parties?
I say the parties in terms of their broad social context, not their narrow administrative bodies.
Okay.
I mean, there's an argument to be made that the super PACs have passed over party organizations in terms of their clout, but they're operating in a cultural ecosystem where there is a blue and there is a red, despite the fact that the largest group of Americans say, I don't want to join a team. And how do you create a space? We saw this in the midterms. We saw what independent voters did. They were all supposed to vote Republican because what you're supposed to do in the midterms is vote against the party in power. You vote Republican. They didn't do that. But now there's a lot of Democrats that I talk to that are like, oh yeah, the independents are now with us. No, they're not with a party. They're voting for candidates. They're doing the best they can to try to move the country forward, protect democracy, vote for candidates, not for parties. But that voice gets drowned out at every step of the way.
Except the last step, right? That's what Henry Olsen reminded us of, that many of the Trumpier candidates, if you will, did not prevail. So at a certain point in the general election, there was a discipline that was, in other words, do we need to change the system?
Well, see, independents, and Henry laid this out very well, they can vote. They can vote in November. And they, in many competitive races, prove decisive. The 8 points, it's interesting how to see that and to see it as kind of a starting point. But 80% of congressional elections are over after the primary. Mm-hmm. They're not competitive in November. Mm-hmm. You know, the vast majority of races at the state assembly level, I mean, I just did some research on this in a number of states. 50% of state legislators run unopposed. In Massachusetts, it's 70%. So we're talking about a level of, there's a myth that we live in a two-party system. 80% of Americans live in a one-party system. Mm-hmm. There is no competition between the Democrats and Republicans in most of America. Virginia being a big exception. There's statewide races that are competitive. But most of us don't have any choice in who our state assembly is.
See, but I'm not sure that's because of the parties. Yeah. Seems to me you can make the argument that since Elaine and I started doing things for our respective parties, the parties are weaker than they've historically ever been. That, in point of fact, they're eclipsed in money by outside groups. The get out the vote operations that used to be a hallmark of the party has really been taken over by outside groups and changes in the media environment. I mean, the messaging itself is not done by the parties. Republican Party didn't even pass a new platform in 2020. It's a little hard to argue that the parties are the driver of increased polarization.
But his point, John's point, is that they run the primaries. They do that.
But there may be a lot of other aspects to this, right?
Of course they run the primaries.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Yeah,
they are, under the Constitution, they are protected by freedom of association. Anyone can form a political party, and once you form a political party, you have to develop a system for nominating your candidates. I mean, you have to do it. And so, you know, the American Constitution Party has a convention, and the Green Party has a convention, et cetera. So somebody has to do that work. I don't quite understand, and Democrats and Republicans through the state legislatures have settled on, in most cases, state-run and state-funded primaries. Now, I don't know, I guess I don't know what's your alternative to that. How else would you do it?
Look, all you have to do is look at California, Washington, Alaska, and Nebraska. These are not theoretical ideas.
Yeah.
I mean, the largest state in the country has a nonpartisan primary.
Yeah, but
And the
everybody
parties-
knows who the
It's got a
Democrats and
71%
Republicans are.
One at a time,
Democratic delegation.
Well-
The both branches of the legislature are veto-proof.
And what's the problem with that?
What's-
All right, let's hear John and then,
Here's the thing, in the nonpartisan primary states, the political parties do just fine. No one's outlawing political parties. They are private organizations, okay? In California, Washington, Alaska, and Nebraska for state legislative, there is a primary, but it's not a party primary. It is the first round. Anybody who wants to run for office appears on the primary ballot. The voters go in there, they can vote for whoever they want. And the top two or the top four go to the general election. If the parties want to make endorsements, they want to determine which is their preferred candidate, they have no problem doing that at all. They don't need the taxpayers to fund that. I don't agree with you, Elaine, that parties are essential, but I don't, even if you hold that position, there is no contradiction between a public electoral process in which political parties, if they're essential, participate in it. I'm suggesting there be a difference between the party process and the public process.
what's wrong with that, Elaine and Ben and Michael?
Well, I mean, I do think the California system is just fine. Okay, I think you're pointing up an alternative that works, but to say that that's going to be somehow going to lift us out of political parties is nonsense. Those primaries are very much won by Democrats and won by Republicans.
Aren't you okay with
Everybody
that?
everybody knows.
I'm not arguing anything about lifting us up from political parties. I'm saying there are Americans that don't like political parties. And I think they should have full voting rights. And they might vote in stupid ways.
Let me
and that's
add a
fine.
weird thing in here. Yes, there are Americans who don't like political parties, and yet when we look at voter turnout, and we look at who votes, over 90% of Republican leaners vote for Republicans and Democrats vote for Democrats. Parties remain the most important predictor of how somebody's going to vote. So they may say they don't like parties, but people actually act within a two-party structure.
You're ignoring the 45% of Americans that are independent.
But they
But
aren't truly independent.
Oh, well, see,
They're
that's,
not
no, that's,
independent.
and I'll tell you.
I want to
Howard,
separate,
They're
there's
not.
it's two
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
strands, there's
In
two
any of
strands
those
here.
states- in
Hang
any
on,
of
hang
those
on, there's
states
two
that you
strands here,
mentioned.
Ben, and I want to make sure we keep them separate. One is, what should the system for choosing candidates be, and what do we think about political parties? Let's
Right.
put aside what we think about political parties and focus on, should we have a California-type preliminary election or some other tweak to our primary process? Ben, you are, I want,
But
go ahead.
I think the point of all the states that you mentioned about open primaries is that this independent movement, which does have the ability to act in those states, has not risen up. There are not independent candidates elected in any of those states. So I'm not sure where I see the popular demand of this alleged 45%.
Well, you're making
manifested
a
itself.
logical fallacy that if you're an independent voter, that what you're interested in is independent candidates. I think there are, the independents
But
that,
then if it's an open primary, isn't that what you want?
no, I'm saying there are voters that do not want to belong to political parties, and they should have full voting rights. They should be able to participate in every publicly funded election.
That's really your core
If the
point.
Republican Party wants to have a convention, go for it. Do it. That's wonderful. I'm not arguing that we should, in some ways, prevent the political parties from doing whatever they want to do. I'd actually say give them more freedom to decide who they want to endorse and who their favorite should be, although they already have tremendous freedom. I'm saying the political process itself should allow people that don't want to be in a political party to fully participate in the publicly funded process, whether that's no primary at all, whether that's a primary and a general and a runoff, whatever it is, everyone should be able to participate in that.
But your own preference is a California-style preliminary, wide-open preliminary, winnowed to 2 candidates who may be from the same party in the final.
Yeah,
That's your own preference.
I like the top 2, I like the top 4, I like the final 5, I like all of them. I like that.
Final 5 is, there'd be 5 candidates
We just
on the
passed it in
November
Nevada.
ballot.
We just passed it in Nevada. You get 5 candidates from the primary, they go to the general election where you use ranked choice voting. It has to,
For 2 finalists,
no, for 5 finalists.
for 5 finalists.
I think there's.
Okay, just to, a lot of stuff flying by here.
Yeah.
There's various options here of preliminary elections and
Right.
final elections, and then how the votes are apportioned in those elections. Ben, you've been leaning in, I want to get to Michael.
I just, the point that if you've got an open primary state, then anyone can come in and vote in either party's primary.
Right.
So you've got that or non-registered states for the vast majority of states. It's only a few closed primary states that don't allow independents and unaffiliated.
Right.
So all of this is about those few states that are closed
No,
primary.
because in the cases you're describing, I think that forcing voters to choose a Democratic ballot or a Republican ballot is increasingly unpopular. I think people want to vote for the best candidates from.
What's the manifestation
Yeah,
of the
how do you know
unpopularity
that's
in any actual election?
People going to vote in Texas, and when they're greeted at the poll, they say, do you want a Democratic ballot or a Republican ballot? If you want the Democratic ballot, stand in that line. You want the Republican ballot, stand in that line. And a lot of people in this political climate, they say, I'm not comfortable with people knowing who I'm going to vote for and which party I'm choosing to vote for in this election. I'm leaving.
All right, that's what's called anecdotal evidence, but it's interesting.
And voter registration lists are public information in every state.
And not everybody,
Yeah,
not
they
every
have-
voter
they have to
registration
be.
includes party. Okay, Michael,
The only concern I have about one concern I have about the California situation is that you do end up with the possibility of essentially 2 Democrats or whoever, but usually it's 2 Democrats. And I don't think that's necessarily a healthy thing for, a democracy because, if you are trying to grow a party, you're trying to do something else like that. If you're forcing people to choose between, vanilla and French vanilla, you're not really giving folks a choice. And to me, as a Republican who wants to have a chance to make my case, if you're going to whittle it down in that way, I think you are, denying the other side of the coin. I think having that other side presented, even if it doesn't win, I think is a valuable and healthy
but
thing
isn't it
for
presented
democracy.
in that preliminary round?
It is to some degree, but if there are 50 candidates, running, and you're in a 75% state that's Democratic, you never get a real chance to make the Republican case or a conservative case, whatever case, to the electorate and persuade
But
in an unfiltered way.
I think Howard, this is an example of the artificiality of the 2-party system. And in some ways, we're in a kind of a mecca of free enterprise here. And I think we should just put it all on the table. Why should an unpopular candidate in California, someone who doesn't come in the first place or the second place, be guaranteed a spot in the finals simply because there is some goal of creating a Democrat versus a Republican election? Why? That's anti-free market. In fact, I had a conversation with Charles Munger, who's the biggest Republican donor in California, and he's saying, thank God we're no longer guaranteed a place on the ballot in California. Now we can see how weak we've become. We can actually get a read of where we are with the voters and respond in the political marketplace instead of this kind of artificial 2-party system which says no matter what the voters think, the Democrats get a spot and the Republicans get a spot.
But there's
All right, go ahead.
There's a sort of a chicken and egg aspect to that, though, because if you're not able to make the argument, You're not able to, you're always going to be stuck at,
always gonna be stuck
I mean, is anybody
I
here?
guess John is saying that
yeah.
the sheer competition makes you hone your argument, but
It does, but it's diluted if you have a field of, I mean, look at some of those candidates that were running in California. I mean, there were, celebrity, all kinds of hoo-ha. I mean,
celebrity candidates in California, I'm shocked.
I mean-
Okay, Elaine and then Ben.
Yeah.
With the kind of open primary system, you've both made strong cases for parties as important intermediaries with the voters.
Yeah.
With the kind of open preliminaries, and by the way, a number of cities have them for mayoralties, Chicago, Boston. With that kind of preliminary California jungle primary, undermine parties, in your opinion, or harm them in some way? Elaine and then Ben.
No, they haven't so far. I mean, the party in Democratic Party in California remains very strong. The Democratic Party in Nevada did pretty well this last time. Washington State, very strong. So they're not undermining parties. What I'm really going to is a more fundamental question. This large number of independents, yes, they call themselves independents, et cetera. There is no indication that they have revolted against the two major parties. They choose, political science has seen this for decades now. There are independent Republicans and independent Democrats, and the number of pure independents tends to be very small. And what I'm questioning is really, where is this revolution? I don't see it. It hasn't happened.
But
you
isn't
just
John
don't
sa-
see it.
isn't
You
John
don't
saying
see
that-
it in the
Well,
legislature.
Isn't John saying that that group is not, because they're not registered by party, not empowered to help choose candidates?
Except because frankly, most of the time they are. I mean, most of these states, this business of being shut out happens in very few states. You basically can get a Democratic ballot or get a Republican ballot. Now, if you don't want anybody to know, okay, that's a different situation. You could probably fix that somehow. But guess what? There's a lot of fluidity in this system in primaries.
I believe that it's the case that there are a number of southern states in which Republicans are looking to close their primaries. Is that accurate, John?
Yeah, there's bills being introduced in Missouri, Alabama, Tennessee, possibly Texas and Georgia, possibly Wyoming. This has been kind of a low burning effort among the GOP for a number of years, but it's starting to gain some momentum, and I think we're going to see a flurry
Are you
of
following
bills.
that, Ben, and does it worry you?
Look, I think it's shutting off potential converts to a party that's quickly becoming more of a minority party. So I think as a political matter, it's not a wise course of action. And I think the RNC rule on presidential primaries is likely to exacerbate state laws. I don't see it as a long-term winning political strategy.
Howard,
Right,
let me
so you're agreeing with Elaine that we're pretty open, we're a lot more open than some of the outlier states would lead us to believe, but we ought to stay at least that open.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, honestly, I think this
That's a
is
strong
not a
view.
real issue.
Michael, real quick.
Yeah,
And I got a Kindle question. or
sorry, yeah. No,
Twitter
so, I
question.
mean, my only, sort of thought on that is, people say, we're going to, if we close the primaries, we did a convention, you're going to shut people out, they're going to, not gravitate to your party. People have been gravitating to the Republican Party of Virginia ever since Glenn Youngkin won. So to me, the best thing we can do as a Republican, just as a partisan Republican, is win elections. And the best way to win, and govern well, which I think Governor Youngkin has done. But to do that, you've got to get a consensus candidate. And the best way you can do it is the best way you can do it, whatever that may be. I happen to think that a ranked choice voting, whether it's instituted in a primary setting or in a convention setting, we did it in a convention because we couldn't do it in the primary setting. Some states allow it, Virginia doesn't. But if you start winning elections and you govern well, then you're going to really grow the party. If you nominate candidates that are not electable, don't appeal to a consensus group, you're not going to grow. And so to me, it's really, the process is just a means to an end.
Right, and that circles back to Kevin Kosar's point in the first panel, which is we need people who are interested in governance.
Right.
Okay, I've got a question on Kindle and if on Twitter, and if I ignored that, that would be very bad. This is for the group. With ranked choice, this is from Patrick James, thank you, Patrick. With ranked choice voting and proportional representation taking hold in some states and major cities, how might this affect the party system at the state and national level? Might there be effects from these dispersed reforms that ladder up to national changes? I'm going to ask Ben and, well, Elaine leaned in first.
Yeah, let me lean in on this. I mean, I like ranked choice voting for primaries, and I'll tell you why. I think for party primaries, and it's being used. I think we're going to approve more ranked choice voting states in the coming cycle in the Democratic Party, for one reason. Usually the ideological differences between a group of Democrats running or a group of Republicans running are not that enormous, but people have they're all people in primaries struggle between voting their heart and voting their head. So their heart might say, "Oh, geez, I really love Bernie and that fighting spirit, but I don't really think he can win." So ranked choice voting allows you to do both. Right? It allows you to do both, to put your heart first and your head second, or vice versa.
So you like it?
I like them. I like ranked choice voting for party primaries, and I think it's a good way to get to a consensus candidate.
Right, and Ben?
I kind of agree with that. I mean, it is the quickest way to get a consensus candidate quickly, right? You don't have to go through a runoff. You don't have to go through a secondary system. Got a candidate with over 50% who's geared up to go, and everybody's sort of bought into the system. In terms of...
Although there is the criticism that it forces every voter to vote strategically in complex ways.
Well, you can bullet vote, just vote for one candidate. There's
Yeah,
no
you can just do that.
requirement that you do it that way. In terms of making a real impact nationally, I think you got to look at the amount of time it's taken to get ranked choice voting implemented in any state. You mentioned Nevada. That's not implemented yet. It's got to go back before the people in 2024, and opponents will be more aware of it, and it's not in place. So there's a lot of interest in it now because the country is so polarized. But it would take a really long time to implement in the face of what I think will be a lot of opposition.
Right, but remember what Elaine said. She favors it for primary elections. Parties can make those
Yeah,
rules.
that's a party
Parties
rule, and
can
that can be
decide.
done
And
quickly.
that's our topic today, is primary elections. So that seems like a lower hanging fruit. Is that what your view is?
Yeah, it's easier for the parties to do it. They can make that decision. Now, the problem is doing it within the context of a state-run and financed primary, because you have to have a sort of different system for counting, et cetera. And again, ranked choice voting is one of those ideas that political scientists had half a century ago, and all you could think was, oh my God, how could we do that, right? And now, of course, you just program it, and you program it, it's easy to do. So computers have really opened up the possibility for this, or IT has opened up the possibility. So I think that parties are going to start to use it. I do think they'll start to use it for the simple reason that they want to do what you guys did in Virginia. Find themselves a consensus candidate. The big problem with primaries, I don't think it's because states control them or anything like that. I think the big problem with primaries is you can have an intense minority of a political party running and nominating somebody who is not liked by the rest of the party and who loses. And you can't, because there's no peer review, because there's no party leadership input into primary systems, we tend to get extreme candidates on the right and on the left who people don't really like. Okay, and people are really unhappy with. And then to the extent that they do get elected from very red or very blue districts, they go into Congress and they're just not good legislators. They don't do the people's work because they're too busy being a showboater as opposed to a workhorse. And I think that's a real problem.
Right, and political science talk about the median voter and have we diverged from the median voter. And I think our whole discussion this morning has really been about the phrase that Michael Ginsberg uses: how do you reach consensus candidates who are interested in governing, which is what
That's
Kevin
right.
Kosar reminded us about in the first panel. But we have many routes to that which were on the table this morning. Please join me in thanking our panel, John Updike, Ben Ginsberg, Michael Ginsberg, and Elaine Kamarck.